My name is Pete Gerges. I'm the community leader for the ecology, evolution, and biodiversity community here at ASM. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Beth Oates. I work for ASM doing the Council of Microbial Sciences. You'll probably hear us everywhere because that is the goal of this year, is to get everyone to know what comms is and then keep building on the good work that we've been trying to work really hard and do this year.
Absolutely. So to give you a little sense of what we are going to touch upon, over the last several months, I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Oates and Mr. Siegel, and then as well as Dr. Bertuzzi and others in ASM leadership in thinking about the EEB community. And we recently had a retreat. And that was a great opportunity to reflect on this community and where does this community originate? How does it relate to other communities here at ASM? And where are we headed? So we're going to be talking a bit about those topics, as well as the way in which comms is helping lead not only EEB, but the other communities in ASM. And we want to leave some time at the end to hear your questions. So to get us started, I wanted just to remind all of us a little bit about what this community is, this ecology, evolution, and biodiversity community. Microbiology has its origins in really environmental science going back about 400 years. When you think back to the days of Antoine von Leeuwenhoek and other scientists who began looking at the presence of these, animalcules, as he called them, or microorganisms in the environment. And then there was this growing interest in understanding why diseases spread the way they do. How does it relate to wastewater? Why do we see the patterns of illness we see in nature? And over that 400 years, these early microbiologists began looking at not only those sort of first glimpses into the microbial world, but really relating it to the chemistry and the physical conditions, the hydrology, the human migration and distribution, all of it, to really understand what these organisms were doing. And as EEB continued to grow, or rather environmental biology, I should say, continued to mature, we began to see scientists looking at how microbes shape the chemical environment around us, right? And we know that microbes, today we know that they're the stewards of our planet, right? They run the biosphere. I believe that we humans are incidental. So if you wiped out all of us, the planet would go on. Many ways better, right? But if you wiped out all the microbes, we would no longer have a biosphere. It would come to a halt. This community of environmental microbiologists has been really thinking long and hard about the relationships between microbes and the world around us, chemistry, hydrology, you name it. And in many ways, EEB has played this really special role in ASM of thinking about the relationships between microbes and other planetary processes, and frankly, other anthropocentric processes. Why do some human populations get sick and others don't? Today, we find ourselves on the cusp of trying to use our more contemporary technologies to answer many of these same questions. Right? We've learned a lot in 400 years, but we have so much to learn. And today we wanted to talk with you a bit about what the EEB community has been doing, and then of course where we're headed. So one of the things, Beth, I was really keen on talking with you about here was, from your point of view, with your ASM hat on, as they say, and having been a part of this EEB retreat, what are some of the ways in which you think EEB can play a role not only in working with ASM to advance EEB, but to really help our community better relate microbiological data to other kinds of data?
Yeah, so to paraphrase from our CEO yesterday, I think EEB really is the tiny looking within the big, right? You're looking at the microbes on a very big scale, but ultimately that data still goes back to the microbes. It still goes back to the small aspect. And you take a look across the microbiology field, and although the data might be written in a different language, per se, it's still part of what it means to be a part of microbiology. just on that level. And then you're looking at how can we then create these cross communities across EEB, across with host microbe, because there is both a lot of nuances, but there's also a lot of broad, big areas of where the science is really going and ASM's place of how best to help support the science for those directions, both the nuance as well as the big, big picture.
Yeah, that's a really great way of summing it up, because as we were working together on this retreat to think about where is the EEB community headed, we realized that this is a community that has a deep understanding of how to deal with big and complex data sets. Mm-hmm. And we've been doing this for a long time. And it occurred to us that there's a lot of value in offering that perspective to other communities for whom this might be newer. Perhaps the human gut microbiome community might be a good example. As many colleagues of mine at my institution study human gut microbiomes, they turn to myself and my colleagues and say, how do you make a chemical measurement at an appropriate scale? Right? How do you understand the fate of compounds as they advect or diffuse through an environment? And so I think, Beth, that what I'm inspired by hearing you say and others in ASM governance is that you all will work with this EEB community to kind of provide the opportunities for us to engage with other communities.
Absolutely. And so one of the things with antimicrobial agents and resistance, I think one of the things that we also have to consider with that, like they have their own booth, they have their own talks, but all of that relates back to ecology, back to evolution. You're not going to get resistance in a microbe unless it sees something to become resistant to. Right. You're not going to have them, and that's where are they, like you have the genetic evolution aspect, but you also have the ecology. They're in an environment that can see it. So how can we then work, like that is already naturally crossing just two, and then you take that further, and then you bring in the human aspect, and then you bring in the Anthropocene aspect. Right. And the more you really go into the science, the more you find out we put these communities together, but that's just not how science works. And it goes back to, this is all about the globalization, and it's not necessarily what we would traditionally think of it, but creating those cross communities. And then from there, when we have a strong foundation between our own microbiologists, then we can take that even out of ASM and start working with other organizations, with other specialties, with the engineers and math people, because bios don't do math, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you know, so the fact is, many of our communities, we have our own culture, right? Pardon the pun. But, you know, EEB does things a certain way. There's a kind of culture that builds around microbiome research, and then the antibiotics and antibiotic resistance community. And what that tends to do is keep us to kind of rather inward looking, right? And what was inspiring to me was to see ASM government step up and say, okay, EEB, you have something to offer. And it's this kind of perspective on how to relate different complex data sets. But in turn, other communities have a lot to offer us. So I'm an environmental microbiologist who studies what microbes do in the ocean and understand their relationship to animals and symbiosis. I think a lot about how they shape biogeochemical cycles, even make rocks. But in many ways, I don't have the kind of depth of perspective that my colleagues who study, for example, human microbiome or livestock or other insect symbioses, right? Folks that have a model system that allows them to gain deeper insights. So I see an opportunity also for EEB to learn from other communities. And you know, one of the things, Beth, we talked about was how to facilitate this kind of exchange. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, and again, that kind of goes back to the more we get into our own specialties. And I mean, think about when I was doing my dissertation, like that's an own language that's separate, and like trying to take that out of even my own department and talk to other grad students. They're like, I don't know what you are talking about. And so I think that kind of goes back to the more we try and distill it down into these different silos, the more you end up creating an accidental new language. Mm-hmm. So then you have to take a step back and you have to be like, okay, we need to be able to communicate. And if we can't do that just between humans, then how are we supposed to expect that to be shown across the data? And so now we have talking about these big data sets, talking about the omics, the a whole bunch
Right.
of different types of omics. But the way that we can utilize, it might be very similar methodology, but what we end up looking and taking that data looks so different when you go, okay, yeah, we're going to do a whole bunch of mass spec, and they're going to do that with the host microbe. And when they publish it, it looks very different than if you did mass spec and then you took it from the ocean and that type of sample. And so you have, again, where ASM has the ability to see where it is. We can see where the microbiologists are, what we're doing, what all of them are doing, and then how can we help facilitate that translation to the different community languages, and then try and get something where we're really building onto, to coin the term, hot topic of data standards, data accessibility. All of that can be done through ASM as a foundation by working with the members who have the specialty and are excited and willing to help us then build in that translation and work across the different communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've been a member of ASM for about 2 decades, right? And let me speak with my ASM member hat on. I have plenty to do to raise the funds and to try and do my very best to mentor my early career colleagues in the lab and to try and keep an eye on the advances in my discipline. And one of the things that inspires me about coming to ASM is being able to hear about others who study microbes from a completely different vantage. And that makes ASM a unique opportunity to really expand our understanding and thinking about how we approach our own science. And I love the enthusiasm I've heard in the voice of Beth Oates and Alan Siegel and Stefano Bertuzzi and others with whom I've worked who represent ASM governments, because I see them really wanting to play a role in catalyzing our interactions. Now, I don't know how many of you all sitting here joining us today are EEB. I don't know how many of you are HMB or associate with other communities. But I do know that all of us have this interest in better understanding the microbes that shape our planet and keep this biosphere alive, right? So I'm really inspired by what I've heard from ASM governance. And there's another dimension to this I want to touch upon before we turn it over to you all for your questions. ASM has an international, it's an international organization. We have international colleagues. And I find that, frankly, there are structural impediments through many U.S. funding agencies to engaging with our international colleagues. And I think ASM is uniquely situated to really foster dialogue between those of us who are working here in the U.S. and those working in other nations. And from my point of view, as someone who studies the ocean, the world's largest feature and arguably most complicated system, we are not going to get much farther than where we're at unless we really do truly international science. And so I'm really inspired to hear what you have to say about.
Yeah, so especially looking at ASM, we've been, although American Society for Microbiology turns out is an international organization, regardless of the American aspect of the name. But with that, there's been a lot of push between, there's the Young Ambassador program that includes country ambassadors, there's the education and different fellowships, like trying to build into that diversity, because it's not just the diversity of its own science, it's who's doing the science. And goes back to, we have the globalization. These microbes are everywhere, everywhere. So, big shock, our microbiologists are everywhere. So, kind of building that back in, that's part of the thing. And so ASM, being this big organization, the whole point is really for us to work with our members to help facilitate the conversations, to create productive changes that are effective and will continue to push both microbiology, but just science in general forward. We're at the cutting edge. We're going to continue doing the science. We're going to continue keeping it going. But it's really working with the staff and the members and trying to find those common grounds and identify where's the best opportunities for us to make effective changes.
Absolutely. And that was one of the most inspiring things about our retreat, was an emphasis on actionable items. Now, I don't know, Beth, if there's anything else you'd like to share before we wrap it up and turn it over. What do you think?
No, I think that that's we're right at time. But I wanted to thank everybody. And if you're interested in learning more about the Council of Microbial Sciences and how we look to the future and see where we're going and how best ASM can build us there, we're more than happy to talk to you off stage, away from a microphone.
Absolutely. I have a request of you all, right? It is important that ASM representatives, community leaders such as myself, folks like Beth who run the enterprise, hear from you. So again, as someone who's been a member of ASM for 2 decades, I spent maybe the first decade just sort of showing up and not really making my voice heard. But things don't change unless we hear from you and your perspectives. So go to the meet and greets, pull someone aside if they're wearing an ASM comms pin, and ask any and all questions that come to mind. Have your voice heard. That's how we come up with fresh and innovative ideas. Not from just the 2 of us sitting around, to be candid, but from really hearing your take. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.